Hello, and welcome back to Talking About Maya. In this video series, we're going to cover MASH. This is the first official video after the intro video, where I will go over how to access MASH networks, how they work by, just a high-level overview of them, as well as a couple details about the distribution and repro MASH, uh, along with the instancer version of it. So let's get started. You'll need to create some polygons for MASH to act on for the repro MASH version of it. And to access MASH in general, you have a couple options. We can go into the animation main set menu, or the FX also has MASH available in there. I'm going to keep it to the animation section though. I'm going to just roll that down and tear it off. With my cube selected, I'm going to go to create MASH network option box. And here, if you reset to normal settings, this is what MASH comes to as by default. A couple suggestions I want to make. I like mesh networks, but instancers are much, much faster. So if you can get away with an instancer, probably want to use that most of the time. We're going to start by talking about mesh networks first. I I tend to prefer to have name on creation so that I automatically am organizing my outliner as I go. Down here we have different distribution types. A linear distribution kind of automatically sets it up to have 10 objects in a straight line. We've got a radial distribution here that does the same thing, but with a circle in two axes. So XY or XZ or YZ or anything like that. There's a grid distribution, which is useful for certain effects. We'll get into all of these later. There's also a spherical distribution as well as what I like to refer to as a null distribution, meaning that it doesn't actually distribute or create copies of itself. Or actually, in hindsight, it does create copies of itself, but it doesn't distribute it automatically for you. So we're going to go ahead and go with that one as our default from now on. I'm going to name this one QB. So you'll notice that nothing really changed because we use the null creation set. So we're going to open up our MASH editor window from our tear off, which again is available in the animation main setup here. I'm going to go back to my modeling main set. Additionally, you may see me using the spacebar quick select. It also contains MASH as well as pretty much every other main menu you can imagine in Maya. So if you see this pop up, it's me pressing spacebar and then just um, navigating to where I need to be. So most of what you do in a MASH network is under the attribute editor. So I like to have my MASH editor open so that I can quickly click on different nodes. And it helps me navigate through a MASH network fairly quickly, especially when the scene gets more and more complicated. The first thing I wanted to show off is the MASH waiter. You can see right here, its name is the waiter. This plays host to pretty much every other node that you're going to be adding to your MASH network. You'll see that you can add on a random, a curve node, an ID node, a replicator node. And you can think of these all as modifiers to the base network. Most of what you start with in a MASH network is this distribution node, which is always there. You cannot delete it. You cannot rearrange it. It's pretty much the standard basic. You must always have this node. If we play with the distance x, that basically defines from its starting point how far out it will distribute your objects based on your grid size. You can have it go in multiple axes in a linear fashion, since we are on the distribution linear type. Let's go ahead and zero these two back out. And we'll keep this at a smooth 15 for no other reason than I like the number 15. I'm going to turn off the grid here so we can see our distributions better. Rotations are basically what you would expect. As it distributes linearly, you can tell it how much you want each object to rotate along that distribution. So if you have a full 360-degree rotation, you notice that it's not quite a perfect linear situation. It's more of like a Fibonacci sequence or golden ratio set up here with 10 of these. I suspect if we had 36 of them, you could see some interesting effects with that. Likewise, you can do so in the y direction, which looks like that. And of course, in the z direction. I'm going to take the number of these down a bit so we can see what is happening here. So, I'm going to bring these all back down. The last thing to talk about in a linear distribution is the scaling, which I am going to use two different axes to distribute in so we can see it better. So in the scale x-axis, we can see that along the x-axis, denoted down here by the little gizmo thing, that it will scale to a certain degree based on, if you were to put in 1, it would double in size by the end of the distribution. And if you put in like 5, it was 5 times the original size. So this is the same throughout all the axes. Offset is an interesting, it's an interesting little attribute in that it offsets from your original point and maintains the same distribution and maintains the same scaling effect, but it acts as if you are a further number of points into your distribution. So let's say we have an 18 offset here. If I were to bring this back down and put this to 18, I mean, nothing would really happen there. It's kind of a hard one to describe, but you can imagine a line in the x and y directions where you are going off into space, and the effects of scaling are kind of multiplicative over time, or at least linearly applied. So play around with offset. It's kind of an interesting little attribute that really is underutilized by me, especially. All right, let's talk about radial. So these are all just different distribution types in the distribute node. So we'll be going over many of these, not all of them, because some of them apply more to dynamics, some of them apply to paint effects, and they're just not all really applicable for a non-animating scenario. So we will gloss over a few of them. Now, with that said, we're also going to gloss over some of the really nitty-gritty details of each of these distribution types because they share many commonalities. So for radial, the main difference is the radius with which your distribution type is applied. We'll go back to our distribution node here. If you increase the radius, of course, that's the distance from here to the center, which an object is pushed away from. One strange, not strange, but kind of useful attribute is this angle, which if you put to certain different angles, you can have an effect that only creates a semicircle in this case of 180 degrees. So if I were to fill this out to something like 80 of them, you can see now that it's really close to being a perfect half circle. For whatever reason, it's never quite perfect, so you may have to play with that to get the right visual effect that you want. Bring this back down to 10 and 360 degrees. Part of that, I think, is that they don't want these two objects to be overlapping when you get to 360 degrees. So they actually build in this buffer here so that 360 degrees is actually here, but it distributes to only this point. It's kind of a built-in safety net that is kind of aggravating to work around when you're trying to use, angled degree numbers that you think should be working, and they're just not. They're just not. It's sort of infuriating sometimes. So just do your best with that, as awful as that sounds. Yeah. So as you can see, we'll skip over z offset for a second because in the x and y axes, it goes up and down. And the y and z axes, it goes up and down in, the opposite or the perpendicular orientation. And under z and x, you see it goes flat. And in all of these, the z-axis is treated based on the way that it is oriented. But you can see that with the xy axis, it goes in these, not in the, it goes in the z axis direction at all times. So if we really exaggerate this, we can see this happening with the YZ. Make a liar out of myself. So I think instead of calling it a Z offset, a different name would have probably been more applicable. It's sort of the distribution's normal offset. So let's say that this is pointing up in this direction. When you increase the Z offset, it goes along that axis, and it just behaves the same way across all of them. And it can be a really quick way to get a nice spiral effect. So if we were to increase this quite high, and then increase the number of points, you can see that if you were to duplicate this repro mesh and then turn it on its y-axis 180 degrees, you can very quickly get like a double helix sort of effect. So just some fun stuff just to get us rolling there. Go back to our distribution tab. So moving on to a spherical orientation or a distribution tab. We can see that if we increase the number of points to something kind of extreme, you can really start to make out the shape of the sphere. If we go and we change the angles X and Y to roughly 180 on each, we can see that we get this. I don't know why we do that, but we get this half sphere, so you can kind of build a hat super fast with that. And if you increase the radius, of course, you get this larger sphere. So you can see that this is the same kind of deal as the radial distribution, but in two separate axes because we now have that three-dimensional sphere being created. Animation speed and animation time. I'm not going to go over those again for the same reason as before. It has to deal with animation, and we are ignoring that right now. So, mesh is actually one of the cooler, more useful distribution types, in my opinion. I'm going to go ahead and create a torus and then smooth it out to add some divisions. We'll give this a division of 2. So when we go back to our distribution tab, you can middle mouse drag your P torus over to the input mesh, drop it in, and suddenly they are being scattered across the entire surface of the torus. If we were to have fewer of them, it sort of dynamically updates the surface of the torus. You can see if we go higher, you can end up with a really dense mesh right here, which can be good if you want it, but oftentimes you'll want to have less than that. Something more akin to this. But for each project, each one makes sense in a different way. The next option here, before we get to all the different methods of distributing on a mesh surface, is push along normals, which, if you're familiar with UV maps, each of these has its normal. In fact, I can actually show what's going on if I go to polygons and then the base normals. You can see that as we push along normals, they are translated in the direction of their parent face. So you can use this interesting effect by using negative numbers and have them kind of go inside the mesh. If we go to a wireframe view, you can see them moving from inside to outside and then back once they hit the positive axis again. You can get this kind of electromagnetic field effect using push normals. So kind of a fun little attribute right there. Let's go ahead and turn off those normals again. Let's see. Using up vector, I've never seen it work particularly well, but it does affect the orientation. So let's say that you go back to your original object, which is just hidden, by the way. and you want to elongate it, hide it again, so that it changes the basic underlying shape. Go back here, we may be able to see their orientations change based on the up vector. So if we try this out with a y up vector, it sort of runs towards the center of the donut. With an x up vector, it's kind of running perpendicular to it, but not all the time. It's sort of an interesting little diagonal effect. And if we go for a Z orientation, or Z, here in the States, we get this weird traffic kind of situation. I don't really understand how this is working, which, for a tutorial guy, I know that's sort of blasphemy, but yeah, it's very, very strange to me. I could see making the y-axis your normal to get certain effects, and X has its place too, but Z is kind of a strange one. So I'm gonna go ahead and not use that for now. The other thing you can do is use selection sets. So if I turn off the match network for now, we're gonna put this guy into face mode, and I'm gonna just make some selections real quick. Oh my dear baby G. So I just want a couple of these guys, roughly in a plus formation. I'm pretty sure that is not perfectly accurate, but that's okay. I will then increase the caps lock the selection by using shift. I think it's less than or greater than, and we'll go ahead and create a selection set, a quick selection set that we'll name rings. When we go back to our distribution, we can actually drag this selection set into the field that says selection set and promptly crash Maya. Cool. Okay. Oh boy. Well then. I It will not take that long to get back there. So I am just gonna keep rolling along. I'm just gonna keep pushing along. Apologies for the slightly unprofessional version of this, but I hope that we're all friends here. I dearly hope that. We're just gonna kind of run through it real quick. Maybe this will be beneficial to you somehow. Also, I will be probably putting in an annotation if I get to it to skip this whole section. Again, if you're not into this sort of thing, that's fine. I understand. I'm gonna call this QB again, just to keep things rolling. Go back to our distribution, get a mesh, pull our torus into the input mesh. Set this guy up to 500 from before. And isolate him one more time. Get our selection set going. Balls. Okay, there we go. Maya can be very frustrating sometimes. All right, so let's create our set again. Rings. Go back to our distribution, and all we have to do now, if we go back out of our little isolated view, go back to our distribution, click and drag your rings selection set into the field named as such, and you can see we actually get sort of what we were after. I'm a little surprised that we did not get a full ring around the entire set. So let's go ahead and quick. All right, we're gonna use our select, and we're just gonna see what happened there. Okay, so I didn't do it wrong. They do go all the way around. Very strange. Very strange indeed. Well, typically speaking, the selection set is a nice, easy way to isolate your selections to just parts of your mesh. So I am. Oh. Oh. We just didn't have enough of them? Well, let's just add a bunch more, shall we? So right about there seems good. So let's say 1500. Okay, 1520 it is. Yeah, I'm not entirely clear as to why that happened, but now you can see that we've got some dynamic looking rings just chilling like a villain. So this is, I think, one of my favorite things to be doing is to use a base mesh object and just roll with it. Like if you were to take just some point, increase it, and then start translating it, this deforms with it. There's no trying to change your lattice structure after the fact. It's just super easy, super quick. And then you can always just hide this again afterwards. So yeah, using meshes to deform Mesh networks is, I think, my favorite part of Mesh in general. So I have spent plenty of time on that. Let's go ahead and move on to the other versions of mesh distributions. So that was scatter originally and component selection set. So we've covered two already. Let's do a vertex selection set. You can see that pretty much the rest of these have to do with the different component types of a mesh. We've got vertex, edge, and face. So on the vertex version, the that is nightmarish. If we look at the vertex version, you can see that along these rings of vertices, the objects in your mesh network are distributed accordingly. Similarly, you can do a random vertex, which I guess uses them as sort of a guideline and then randomizes it. Similar effect for face center and face random face center. Although for face centers, we seem to not have enough to do it properly. So if we flood the mesh, and hopefully it won't crash Maya, you can see that we get this really rigid, striated kind of situation. One thing I do want to mention in these settings for face and edge mode, which are very similar but not quite identical, I'll stick with face center for now, is that you can enable scaling, which will, as the faces get denser and denser together, it will scale your objects to be roughly approximately appropriate. It's a nice way to get a tapered effect that is related to your object. So you can see here when the faces start stretching apart, our objects become wider and wider. I think I'm gonna set this cube back to its original shape, just so we can get a more straightforward view of what's happening here. Yeah. So, and like we talked about last time, you can push these guys along their normals to get this sort of weave effect almost. It's not a weave at all, but yeah. So you can mix these all together and get some really awesome effects. I'm going to go ahead and break the connection on these selection sets. So I'm going to turn off enable scaling, go back to our default settings. So we can move on to voxels, which are fascinating little things that are usually used for fluid dynamic simulations, but I can see why they were included in general, because they're not just useful there. Most of what you're going to do with voxels are in the voxel settings right below face and edge settings. And if you increase the size of your voxels, you get a lower resolution, lower density representation of your mesh. If you lower their size, it quickly becomes this fairly high density representation. Shell only will do outside the mesh, and fill only will do only inside the mesh. I think maybe hiding this is the better way to go. And if you do shell and fill, of course it does both. So it kind of, this is an approximation of your shape. Shell or fill only is sort of the approximation of the volume inside your shape, and shell only is the approximation of the outside of your shape. You can see there's, well, maybe you can't tell, but there are hollows in here. It's not full, so I wish I could show you better, but there you have it. You can limit your voxel count to something a little more sane, like just 10,000 instead of 100,000, and you can really, really densify your shapes. Um, Although it does limit you, so if you go to 20,000, you get substantially more of your shape, but you do run the risk of your computer becoming basically putty in your hands. So let's move on to, I guess, UV space. And I'm not entirely sure how this one works. It's actually kind of snuck up on me. I thought I'd already looked at all these, but UV space seems to. I don't actually know, but it does create an interesting effect, doesn't it? If you can tell me more about it in the comments, please be my guest. I wonder. Yeah, no, it doesn't work. Okay, apologies. So, these are all the different mesh distribution types. Um, Scatter is pretty awesome, just in general. Uh, it allows you to quickly get an approximation of your shape without usually requiring too many of these points, which is handy. But yeah, I think that's gonna do it for that. So let's move on to grid. Hide our torus here since we don't need it anymore. When you initially create a grid, it creates a 3x3 grid for you. You can create a 3x3x3 grid to get this kind of Rubik's Cube-esque situation. Maybe that was too small. Yeah, that's a little closer. 2.5? What do you think? 2.5? Yeah, I like that. So now we got this pseudo Rubik's Cube going on here. Yeah. And from there, you can, increase the number of objects in a given axis. So you can get these kind of effects or anything else. And they don't have to all be square. You can start doing this for, a nice Jenga effect. You can start to use ramps for rotation values, theoretically. It seems to be being ignored right now. I guess because a grid is a grid, it doesn't want to rotate around, so maybe you can't do that. Can you change the bias there? No, no. We're making a liar out of him here, Mr. Mash. Okay. So grid is really nice for creating these sorts of distributions really quickly. So you can emulate sort of a city block, or you can I don't know, whatever you need a grid for. I imagine this would be really useful for something in motion graphics, especially. So, to your heart's content. To your heart's content. The other one I'm going to talk about today is the volume distribution type. So here we have a cube. You can have them all in a point, which I do not recommend. But this would be good if you're going to be doing dynamics and you want them to all emit from a single point, or you can have them emit from a cube shape or from a sphere shape. So let's go ahead and increase the volume of this cube, or of this sphere. And you can see that it's pretty well distributed all throughout the sphere. That's at the 0.5 spherical bias. If you put it to 0, it tries its best to stay to the outside of what a sphere would be. And if you put it to 1, it draws it closer to the center. And you can keep going further and further in until it's like you only have outliers. And most of them are at a single point on the inside here. So you can probably get a nice little explodey outy animation with that. Real technical term, that. And then again, the ramps are being ignored. Wonderful. So the sphere has its own little sets of rules. No, they all behave the same way. So a cube has the same rules as a sphere in this case. It's all about the volume size. Okay, so we've gone over all those guys. Let's return to a linear distribution and radically reduce the number of points here. Oof, wow, that's way less. And we'll just kind of put it along that way. Supposedly, you are able to use these ramps. There we go. It seems that only certain types of distribution are accessible for that sort of thing for each thing. So if you want to, you can really dynamically place these objects. One of the things I like to do is to do rotation ramps. So if you've got a rotate Y at 360, you can play with how it's affected. So if you want to go all the way up to 360 in the middle and then back down to 0, you can easily put a peak, and now you get this sort of rotating one way, rotating back with what would you call that? In animation, there's this onion skinning effect, so you can get like a really solid onion skin effect there. Similarly, if you scale in the Y direction, instead of having it go all the way to 1 by the very end, you can have it get big in the center. And from there, you can also set each tangent to either spline or linear or smooth. And I like splines, so we're going to go with that. And that will sort of visualize the graph for you. If you add more points, you can create sort of a plateau effect here. And so ramps are really useful if you have a specific way of distributing your scaling, your rotating, or your distance across time or across space anyway. If you're not satisfied with it all going from 0 to 1, you can easily change that um, however you like. So you can change the bias ramp to change the positioning over time, how it's linearly distributed. It goes from this kind of linear thing to a spline. Hopefully, you can play with that to your heart's content. I'm gonna go ahead and move on, but if you have any more questions about ramps, again, just leave it in the doobly doobly. I believe that'll do it for all the distribution tab shenanigans. I do want to quickly go over the difference between a mesh mash network and an instanced mash network. So currently we are doing an instanced network, which means that when we grab our instancer, we have our original cube being instanced and modified in our network. So each of these are not actually an object, but you could bake them to become real objects. As such, you can't have as much control over the color of each individual object. You'll notice that when we go back to our waiter, we don't even have color as an option, and you can't animate them um, with the time node. They clearly can still be animated based on other nodes, but this is just inaccessible. So, by contrast, if we take our network, and you can duplicate it by going into the Mash editor and just duplicating it that way. If we take our Mash waiter, which would be this one, and we get our Mash controls by tearing it off from there, we can use utilities and switch to a Mash geometry type. So, instead of an instancer, we now have what's called a repro mesh. And what this does is if you ever want, you can quickly duplicate it, hide the original, and start playing with the different effects. Oh, I see they were kind of overlapping. Look at that. I suppose you probably want to turn off your original network if you're going to do that. So, additionally, you don't have to actually duplicate it to get the same effect, but they are all individually addressable objects when it's a mesh mash network. You'll notice when we go back to this one's, the newly created waiter, we now have a node called color. And I believe you can add things like ramps to change how it goes over time, but it does not appear to be behaving that way. So this is not a tutorial on color. I could not give you a proper one right now, but let it be known that these are individually addressable um, meshes in and of themselves. Whereas with an instancer, they are all geometry that is not actually there, so to speak. So um, you can do a few more things with mesh networks than you can with instancer networks. But by the same token, if you're trying to make mesh networks for things that require many points, you'd find yourself unable to even move your viewport. So instanced is a very efficient way to go and is my typical recommendation for most mash networks. So I believe that was everything. So I'm gonna call that an episode. That was way longer than I wanted it to be. Um, and in the next episode, I believe we'll be going over distribution, which we already lumped into this one, so never mind. We'll go straight into the repro and instancer and talk about some of how those work with an ID node and maybe some curves, and we'll just play around in that one. So thanks for joining me. I apologize for the length of this video. I'll have annotations throughout to make navigation easier. So until next time, thanks for joining me. Bye bye.